Hey everybody, welcome to the Less Intelligence Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Pekulski. So for the longest time, I've been the person perhaps advocating against nutrition being exclusively about calories. And without extending too much into the topics of conversation in today's podcast, Krista Scott-Dixon joins me today, who's the content director at Precision Nutrition and responsible for the incredible things happening over at Precision Nutrition's new curriculum development. We get into health, we get into DNA, we get into performance, we get into calories, we get into what thriving ultimately should look like and how to design it in your life. And ultimately, performance is what we're all after. We all want to thrive. We all want to live at our highest and best, not just barely get by. And Krista Scott-Dixon gives us an amazing, holistic, and I hate that word, but ultimately it's this well-rounded approach that I've been advocating for years, and they do a really good job of turning it into a curriculum for you guys. Anyone who's a coach or ultimately wants to understand this stuff, Krista Scott-Dixon and Precision Nutrition team is an incredible resource for you. Today's podcast is brought to you by Bioptimizers. I've been working with Bioptimizers for 4 years now since they started the product. I'm a massive fan. I suggest about 4 mass zymes per meal on average. Sometimes I take as many as 10 between meals. But that's on a rare occasion where I'm really trying to decrease inflammation. Actually, proteolytic enzymes is one of my favorite ways, if not certainly my favorite way to decrease joint pain and inflammation. And I'll take them between meals when your body's not then going to use those enzymes to break down the protein in your stomach. It's actually going to use it to start breaking down larger protein molecules that can sometimes accumulate on the joints. And I love it. And a larger dose, usually in the morning, sometimes after a workout, is a really great way to bring down that systemic inflammation. So you guys can head over to bioptimizers.com and use the code MUSCLE10, MUSCLE10 to get 10% off. And you also can use that to get any of the other products on the site as well. Masszymes is just my go-to everyday product. I also use their Mag Breakthrough on a consistent basis. I just popped some Gluten Guardian this morning because I thought I might have come into some gluten and my stomach didn't feel so good. So those are great product recommendations from Bioptimizers. Enjoy the show with Krista Scott-Dixon. Krista Scott-Dixon, welcome to the podcast, the director of curriculum at Precision Nutrition and the person that John Berardi credits as the smartest person he's met when it comes to nutrition. So I had to reach out, and the way that I respect John is second to few, and so that comes with a very high regard in my eyes. So thank you for being here.
Well, thanks for having me. And I didn't know John said that about me, and now I feel like, oh my goodness, because he knows lots of smart people. So wow.
No pressure, right? Well, John is a very honest guy, and he tends to speak his mind and speak his truth, and so if that's the reality, I'd love to dig into your brain and kind of discuss how maybe you got into this path. I know you attended York University, and then how did you end up with Precision Nutrition, and maybe why did you become a nutritionist?
Yeah, I mean, I always have a bit of hesitation answering this question because part of me feels like, whatever I say is going to delegitimize me. But also, I do think it's helpful because it really illustrates the fact that most people, I think, have a much more circuitous path into achievement than they expect. And so, I mean, I started out not in nutrition at all. My mother was a dietitian, actually. She was a hospital dietitian for years, and she taught, biology and stuff. So I did actually kind of grow up in a nutrition-oriented environment, but I went to school for fine arts originally, did my PhD in completely unrelated disciplines, was more of a social science degree, which has surprisingly become very relevant because the majority of our clients are now kind of raising the kinds of things that I dealt with in my PhD work. So that was sort of interesting. But as a grad student, if you've ever been a grad student, it's not the most health promoting lifestyle. So I got really out of shape and I was broke and I sat on my ass all day long and drank a lot of beer and ate a lot of fast food. So, and not surprisingly, I got pretty out of shape. And so really my first foray into learning about health and nutrition was to fix myself, was to feel better and, lose the 50 pounds or so that I had gained on a 5 foot tall body. And so, I had access to a university library. I just went in there and started reading all the textbooks. And so that was, it was really self-education in the beginning. And then when I had my quarter life crisis, I guess it would be, and decided to quit academia, I had known Phil Caravaggio, the co-CEO of PN, for a long time, and we'd started this charity together called the Healthy Food Bank. And so I contacted him and I said, hey, guess what? I quit my job. And he said, great, come work with us. And so in the beginning, what I was doing was editing their textbook. So this was the first iteration of what would become the level 1 certification textbook. My job was just to edit it. And they handed me this thing that was like 700 pages of scientific jargon long and said, make it readable. So that was my first job. And then I went on to be a coach using all my skills from adult education and curriculum design and stuff. And then I started writing the program, and here we are 10, 15 years later. So yeah, it's been a really tricky journey. Mm-hmm.
Well, I love the fact that you're someone who is an academic, because I think a lot of the times, nutrition seems to be one of the most subjective things that we have, right? There's the level of subjectivity to it is endless, and everyone seems to think that their way is the right way, and there's so much dogma that exists in nutrition. And this is a very loaded question and maybe too hard to answer, but I'd love to dig down, maybe over this course of the next, however many minutes, into what you think in nutrition is actually objective. And, rather than giving people these subjective opinions and these guidelines, and that's wonderful, but what have you come across in your years as a very academic studying nutrition that we can tell people that is objectively true?
That's actually a great question, because I think there's sort of two pieces to it. Like, what can we tell people? What advice can we give people? But also, how do we know what is truthful and what is not, right? How do we know what we know? And so let me take on the first piece and say that we can look at evidence that tells us, it gives us more like probabilities, so we can think about nutrition, as with most science, in terms of probabilities. This is more likely than this to occur. And so with nutrition, we can look at a lot of evidence, whether that's across cultures, whether that's within the body, like what is actually occurring within the body, what can we observe, and say, okay, this particular choice will not inevitably have this result, but it is more likely than another choice to have a particular result. So we can kind of people will often say, oh, you can use science to prove anything, which is entirely untrue. And especially untrue if we step back and look at the aggregate of what we have learned over the years. And so that's really where the value of scientific research lies, is in the cumulative knowledge and observations and evidence. So that's how we're knowing what we're knowing at this point. And so I think we can say with fairly strong confidence that, first, human beings are highly adaptable and resilient. We are one of the toughest species on the planet in terms of adaptability and the ability to survive under various conditions. So we can eat a whole range of foods. And that's piece number one, I think, is super important to understand, because people will say, oh, look at this population. They eat X, Y, and Z and they're healthy. Oh, look at that population. They eat the exact opposite and they're super healthy. And one of the take homes here is that, yes, humans can survive and even thrive on a wide variety of diets. Many dietary patterns are optimized for the specific populations that they developed in conjunction with, right? People are eating like what's around them, and populations developed around that. But we can definitely say, looking at all these cross-cultural patterns, that in all probability, human beings need protein. We need an adequate and optimal amount of protein. One of the principles that governs us is that surviving is not the same thing as thriving, right? Adequate is not optimal, right? So there's differences. And many nutritional recommendations are really about preventing malnutrition or deficiency rather than being optimal or, being your best, if I can say it that way. So we know that human beings need a certain amount of protein to survive and then a little bit more to thrive. We know that human beings need a proper balance of water, fluid, and electrolytes in their bodies. And so if we consume, for example, highly processed diets, or we drink a lot of alcohol, that balance gets out of whack. So we know that this is a thing that human bodies need. We know that human bodies seem to thrive when given lots and lots of fruits and vegetables and relatively unprocessed plant foods. So, there's debate about whether humans should eat whole grains or should eat beans and legumes. If you can tolerate them and you feel great on them, then you should eat them, right? If you don't, then you shouldn't. It's as simple as that. Human beings need a certain amount of fiber from these unprocessed plants because, our gut microbiome requires sustenance. And human beings need a diversity and a variety of foods. We need to eat the right amount for energy balance, for our physiological functioning. And I'm probably forgetting one or two, key principles. We need to eat the things that are kind of familiar and culturally appropriate and, feel kind of spiritually correct for us, if I can say it that way, are kind of part of like our worldview. But other than that, I think there are very, very few must-haves in human nutrition. And there's lots of room to play within each of those things I just said, really.
Right. So one thing, there's a number of things I want to jump into there. But one thing you said there was the necessity of fiber. And there's a lot of people pushing back on that now. And I'm sure you're up to date on most of the research, and I'm not. And I'd love to hear, is it in fact necessary to consume fiber? Because there's a whole camp of people saying, well, you actually don't. Maybe you can tolerate it, but maybe you don't need it. Any thoughts and
Yeah, I mean, again, surviving is not thriving, right? And I think that if we look at I like to go back to first principles. And so this is, for me, one of the best ways, not to settle an argument exactly, but to gain a deeper understanding of what we're looking at. And so I like to go back to first principles, things like physiology, physiological processes, physiological structures. So if we look at the construction of the human gastrointestinal tract and we compare it to various species, we can see that humans are somewhere in the middle as omnivores. Humans really originated as omnivores and scavengers. So we can look to our evolutionary history, we can look to our current physiology and say, okay, this is the gastrointestinal tract of an omnivore scavenger, more or less, right? So there's a particular length to the small intestine, there's a particular length to the large intestine, there's a particular structure to the stomach. The super high fiber diet eaters would be something like ruminant animals, right? Cows, sheep, right? They have multi-chambered stomachs. They have a particular bacterial environment that they need to digest grass and, other sort of sticks and twigs and whatever else, right? And then if you look at obligate carnivores, they have a much different gastrointestinal tract, and they have a gastrointestinal tract that is designed to like quickly pass things through, right? So we're somewhere in the middle, which tells us that there's probably a balance of foods that we require, plant and animal foods. But also, if you look at our gut microbiome and the physiology of the gut microbiome, you see that our gut bacteria require particular kinds of materials to be present because that's their food, right? So a lot of what we're doing when we're feeding ourselves is actually feeding them.
Sure.
And then they feed us with the metabolic byproducts that they produce. So to put it really simply, no fiber equals no healthy bacteria. No healthy bacteria equals no short chain fatty acids that have important biological functions. So, I find people tend to think in very all or nothing terms, right? It's either this or it's this. It's not really the case.
There's the argument that butyrate is the ultimate end result, right? Which can also happen via different pathways. And who knows evolutionarily if it's the microbiome is being passed generation to generation, what it may have looked like 5 generations or 10 generations ago. And that's kind of where their argument is. It's like, well, maybe we've just adapted to have this vegetable based diet in our microbiome based on the guidelines that have existed in our culture for the last 100 to 150 years. And again, I don't know the answer. I'm always open to an open discussion with smart people to be like, hey, and the answer inevitably lies somewhere, as you say, somewhere in the middle typically, right? Mm-hmm. Some people can probably do really well on a low fiber diet, and some people can probably do really well on a medium to high fiber diet. I'm curious if that's what our common ground is.
Yeah, I think, one of the principles that should govern us in nutritional recommendations is physiological variation and human variation and diversity in general, right? So, whether that's your ancestry, your genetic heritage, the population that you originally come from, whether that's your current environment, there's all kind, your current health and medical situation. Like, we do know that there are people for whom a high fiber diet is absolutely contraindicated, mm-hmm. right? They do not thrive on a high fiber diet. These would be people with inflammatory bowel disease and so forth. But I think if we look at the anthropological evidence, we see that humans have never evolved as obligate carnivores. Like, they have never in their evolutionary path. So, I would agree, like, food has definitely changed in the last 100 years or so, even in the last 50 years. Yeah. But if we turn the clock back, millions of years into our evolutionary past, we can see that the best evidence we have available about our primate ancestors and then our hominin ancestors is that they did consume these foods, whether they were agriculturally obtained or whether they were dug out of the ground or whatever. There's no evidence that we would thrive. Now, the best evidence we have, of course, is our own experience, right? That is the strongest evidence that I will take when I look at a nutrition client. It's like, how are you doing? How do you look, feel, perform? What do your insides tell me? If I look at your blood work, if I look at, all of these physiological indicators, how are you sleeping? How's your mood? How's your energy? And especially over the long term. Because I think what happens is people will start a new diet, right? And in a week, they're like, oh my God, I feel awesome. I have so much energy. And then like 6 weeks, 6 months, a year from now, the picture is much, much different, right? And we want to be curious about what was the actual cause of you feeling better. Was it because you took out crap? Was it because you added something? Was it because often when people, for example, start the so-called carnivore diet, they're eating more protein? We really want to be clear, what is the thing making the magic here? Right. And I often find that when folks talk about diets, they ascribe particular effects perhaps to the wrong cause, or we don't always know what causes things, right? And the placebo effect is extremely strong. In our recent curriculum, we've actually started to elevate placebo, kind of jokingly, but kind of not, as one of the most powerful supplements you can take, right? So this is a very powerful thing. And so we just want to be cautious. And the ultimate evidence is the data that you have on yourself over the long term.
Right. So you mentioned anthropology, and that's really interesting because that's something that I think has been brought to the forefront a little bit lately is kind of eating for your ancestry based on where you've come from and on the planet. And I'm curious to hear your perspective on that. Do you think there is a lot of merit there, or if people's epigenetics kind of manipulated things so much to this point that it isn't going to have that much of an influence at this point?
My guess is that it probably has different effects in different people. And one of the challenges in talking about human populations is that ancestry is extremely complex, right? Even if we're talking about the so-called cradle of civilization, which would be Africa, there's just a massive amount of genetic diversity there, right? And then there's also these little hotspots of genetic diversity elsewhere in the world. Some of them are kind of unexpected, like Micronesia, right? Is very genetically diverse. And so, ancestry is very much not a straightforward thing. So unless, your people have been living in some isolated mountain village for thousands of years, you're really not going to get a genetically clear lineage of yes, this is a very constrained set of conditions and we've been doing this, and so we should continue to do this. I mean, the best you can do is kind of shoot it into the ballpark of general hypotheses about what you could try. But again, I'd circle back to the fact that the only evidence is that of your experience. And even within particular populations, it's not a population of clones, right? It's still a heterogeneous population, even within, this particular small group. So it's kind of a yes and a no and maybe, right? It's this could give you clues. And also, it's not just with the physiology, but eating in a way that, your ancestors may have also connects you to that heritage that you have in a way that might be psychologically satisfying, right? If you're from an indigenous population and you are eating the foods that your ancestors ate, I mean, there may be physiological merit to that, but there may also be it may, I think of it as filling the soul. This may also be psychologically deeply important to you. So the answer is almost always, it depends. Right. I hate to say.
Yeah, it's all right. It's better than being dogmatic, I'll tell you. So, how about DNA? So obviously precision nutrition is seen as one of the most cutting edge nutrition certifications on the planet. How much are you guys actually looking at DNA and its implication on how we should actually be eating? So I feel as though, and you can obviously give me your opinion on this too, I feel as though that's the future, right? It's we'll have a DNA printout going, hey, this is what your body is predisposed to. Here's how you metabolize fats. Here's how you metabolize carbs. Here's your inflammatory pathways. Here's the vitamins and minerals you're deficient in. Go, right? And then maybe it's an adaptable thing based on epigenetics. And maybe we'll have, hopefully in the future, we'll have the ability to go based on your stress levels, based on your exposures. Here's this combination of things that you need to ultimately support every system in your body. Are we heading down that path? Have you guys started that, opened up that chapter yet? And do you think that's the future?
It's a super complicated question. I mean, we do have a free ebook available on genetic testing and what it can tell us about, and it's quite extensive, right? So we do a deep dive into this, and for advanced commentary on this, I would definitely refer you to the people that have PhDs on our team in this area, right?
Yeah.
But
who's that?
That would be Helen Coleus, Dr. Helen Coleus, who's our PhD of molecular biology. Yeah. There's a few pieces to this. So one of them is the question, can we produce at this stage in 2020 a blueprint based on your DNA for how you should eat? And I think the answer to that is definitively no, we cannot. I mean, the amount of known variation like that we know about in a population that is applicable to you, we know like just a tiny fraction of what the situation is, let's say. We also know that many things are complex, right? So they don't just result from a single variation, they result from multiple variations, right? So your ability to process cholesterol, for example, or your ability to metabolize carbohydrates. And again, even within carbohydrates, there's like multiple, are we talking about sugar? Are we talking about fiber? Like, what are we, are we talking about starch? Like, glucans, like, what are we talking about? So we really cannot say with full confidence at this point, yes, this is exactly what you should be eating. Maybe in 50 years, we can do that. So we're not there yet, but we could be. I mean, it's clear to see how this is going. But the other piece is that even if I gave you a perfect nutritional blueprint and said, you have to eat exactly 3 grams of broccoli a day or whatever, right? We have to get you to do it. Like, that is the huge piece that people leave out all the time of like, even if you give someone an absolutely brilliant prescription that is spot on for everything they need, you have to get them to do it. They have to have the skills to execute. They have to have the desire to execute. And that is a huge missing component. And finally, like most of these recommendations still circle around these core principles. Like, no one's DNA is so exceptional that they're eating rocks or trees or something like that, right? Like, it's still going to come down to, eat enough protein, eat your fruits and vegetables. Like, it's going to come down to these core principles that most of us should be practicing anyway. So I do think that there is a little bit of fantasy and magical thinking in genetic testing and nutrigenomics. I'm not saying it's not a valid science, it absolutely is. But I think in terms of whether this is relevant for actual people doing things in the real world, I'm not as confident about
I think
that.
it may just be, where my brain goes is like, hey, Krista, you need a little extra protein based on we see happening epigenetically over the last 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, sure.
Bump your protein up, and then we can almost track it. If we're doing blood work anyways, maybe we have the ability to pull epigenetic marks from each blood sampling. Maybe it's happening yearly. Based on the last 12 months, you've had exposure to this, you've had too much of this, you need a little more of this. That might be a very realistic thing.
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
It would have to be an ongoing tracking, whether or not people are willing to do that.
Sure. And we can do that. We can do that now, though. I mean, this is the thing, right? Like, so much of what we're going to be doing would be just confirming what a really good intuitive coach would probably already know. And I think that's sort of the funny thing. It's like, do you need more energy? Do you need less energy? Well, we can start with a predictive equation based on your age and your body weight and your, activity, all that kind of stuff. And we'll get you in the ballpark, and then we'll fiddle with it a little bit. So like in practice, a lot of it would not be different. I do agree that it's extremely cool. I mean, I think there's just massive potential there to learn about ourselves and how we are as unique organisms, and also how we're connected to the rest of humanity. Like, I don't want people to go away thinking, oh, Krista's pooping on DNA. It's like, no, this is extremely cool and interesting. And there's so much potential in really understanding the complex interactions between, our DNA, our environment, what we consume, and so forth. So there's lots of cool stuff there. It's just it doesn't work the way that people assume or want it to work. I guess that's how I would put it.
Yeah. So kind of shifting gears a little bit, how would you recommend, or what do you recommend for people to start establishing baseline calories? So, we get a lot of coaches all the time go, hey, like, where do I start my clients with calories? Is it a particular equation you use? Do you have a particular thought process on where you suggest, or where maybe PN suggests everyone establish their foundational calories?
Yeah, we don't actually, I want to be really careful when I say this. We absolutely believe in energy balance, right? We believe in the laws of thermodynamics. So I don't want, one of, I think, the mistaken beliefs about precision nutrition is, we don't believe in calories, right? To me, that's like not believing in gravity. But what we do begin with is looking much more at people's holistic practices. Like, what are they actually doing in their daily life? And so for most clients who are not, so we divide clients into various levels of skill, levels of how specific they need to be to get to their goals, right? So someone who has very advanced goals, has very advanced skills, would have a much different approach than someone who's just a regular person who just wants to feel better, right? So typically with most of our clients, we don't actually start with a calorie target. What we start with is something like teaching them about their hunger and their fullness cues, right? Are you hungry right now if you're about to start eating? As you're eating, do you know whether you are full, right? So we actually like to start with teaching a lot of appetite awareness rather than giving them a calorie target, because what happens is if I give you a calorie target, people don't typically know how to eat unless they have that calorie target in front of them, right? And for most people, that's, they adhere to it for a week or 2 weeks and they're like, I'm done with that. We do like to teach energy intake in terms of hand-sized portions, which is typically easy for people to understand and do. But in terms of calculating, like, what is your intake? Let's say we had a client for whom that would be appropriate. We actually have a calculator that Brian St. Pierre developed. So we have a pro version and like a regular person version. So the pro has all these like advanced customizations. So we looked at all the predictive equations, Kevin Hall's work, the National Institute of Weight Management or whatever it is. So we looked at all of their equations and compiled them into a calculator. So I would say, 2 years ago, I would have said, we use, standard equations or coefficients. Now I'm like, we would just put it into the calculator and say, what's your goal? What's your weight? How old are you? What's your biological sex? What is it you want to do? And the calculator would say, okay, this person for their goals and needs would need to eat X amount of energy. And then here's how it breaks down into a daily menu of hand-sized portions. You would need to eat so many palms of protein, so many fists of vegetables, and so forth. So that's how we do it. So a lot depends on who is the person in front of me. What am I starting with? Is giving them a prescribed energy intake even the most appropriate way to start for this client? And a lot of times it's not. It may be later, but it's not often in the beginning. So I don't know if that truly answers your question, because the answer is like we put it into a calculator.
Of course, I get it.
We're lazy people. What can I say?
Yeah, I get it. That's the modern way, right?
Yeah.
A lot of my audience is much more high level, right? People who are going to follow a diet. People who are like, hey man, tell me exactly what's the optimal way to do it.
Right.
We have, loaded with professional athletes and high level entrepreneurs who are like, hey, tell me exactly what I need to do to perform at my highest and best. And that's why that question comes up a lot, is because they're like, well, should I be eating an excess of calories? Should I be eating a deficit in calories, or should I be isocaloric, and should I be calorie cycling? That's kind of where that question was going. It's like,
it makes total sense. And I mean, the simple answer is we start with a baseline and iterate over time, right? So if you were that kind of client, we'd say, okay, cool. Here's your starting. Here's our opening bid for you, right? Here's what your plan is going to look like for this week. Come back at the end of the week. We'll measure your indicators, see how you look, feel, perform. Are you moving towards your goal? Are you moving away from your goal? And over time, we sort of like prototype and iterate towards the optimal amount for you, which does change, right? So I might not lead with calorie cycling if someone just needs a simple deficit or a simple surplus or, a maintenance intake. We can add that in over time if the goal requires it. But we like to kind of, keep things as simple as possible, because, if we're talking about athletes and entrepreneurs and busy people, these people don't have time or energy or attention to be doing a lot of the fiddling with the knobs and the dials, right? Like our game is always the judo of it, right? What's the optimal leverage point? What's the least amount of work we can do for the most impact? And then we leave the rest alone if it's not necessary.
So someone comes into a precision nutrition certification or working with one of the precision nutrition coaches. Is it just looking at nutrition, or are they looking at all the other lifestyle factors as well? So it's not just, hey, here's what you eat. Are we looking at sleep? Are we looking at stress? Are we looking at aerobic fitness? We're looking at exercise. Like, how do you guys involve that into the equation?
Yeah, we're looking at all of it, to be honest. Like we have this model we call deep health. And the idea is that there's being healthy, thriving, right? Achieving optimal performance is actually a function of all these different domains of your life, right? So even if you're a high-level athlete at the peak of your physical condition, if your mind is all messed up, if your relationship is going wrong, if you're stressed out about money, if you have a long commute, whatever, that is going to affect your performance, even if you have all of the other physical aspects in place. So we actually, try to take a very holistic perspective and say, how are you sleeping? What's your stress level like? How are your relationships? How's your social support? What's around you? Do you have a deeper why? Do you have a sense of purpose for why you're even doing this right now? How connected do you feel to what you're doing? How's your thinking? How's your learning? How's your memory? Like, we kind of look at all of these domains and try to come up with a program that maybe we can't directly address all of them. Like, I can't fix your relationship with your intimate partner, right? But we can kind of call it out as something that may affect what you're doing in our work together. So we try to address all of these things in some way or another. And a lot of the skills that we teach are skills that have impacts on these other deep health domains. So like your mental fitness, for example, we teach visualization, mental skills, planning, prep, all that kind of stuff that then has an amplifying effect on the other physical goals that you've got.
So let's walk through one of those. You said mental prep or mental skills. What does that look like? So someone comes in and they're stressed and they're saying, hey, you know what? I'm really doing really well with my diet, but I'm not getting the results I want because X, Y, and Z.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, and stress is a very broad concept, right? So let's say that there's kind of, we first want to discern like what are all the multiple sources of the stress, right? So one of the first steps might just be, we have this little tool we call the wheel of stress, right? It's like a pie, and there's different wedges for different domains. And we might say, like, sit down with you and say, just color in the pie wedges with how much stress you're experiencing in all of these different domains. And so like that might be our first step with a client, to surface the data about, okay, what's actually going on here? Okay, cool. So you've named, these particular domains as areas that are causing you some of the most problems. Where would you like to start to work here? Like, we're not going to tackle all of these, but where would you like to start to work? So then, depending on the situation, we might teach things like, simple meditation, right? Changing your sympathetic parasympathetic balance, right? Dialing down your level of being amped up all the time. We might teach simple visualizations. We might use some basic CBT techniques, right?
You guys teach that in the course. You teach CBT in the course, yeah.
Yeah, some basic CBT. And we don't call it CBT because I think that sort of gets us into hot water with, scope of practice. But there are some super basic CBT techniques like planning, or noticing or keeping records of awareness of particular things, or creating a classic CBT one is something like exposure, right? Creating a risk hierarchy. Where do you notice your habits going off the rails? Let's take a list of all the common situations in your life and let's rank them, from 0 to 100 in terms of difficulty. And where do you notice the wheels coming off the bus in terms of your habits? Okay, cool. Let's target there and let's gradually help you work through these increasingly difficult situations in successful ways. Again, maybe we use visualization, maybe we use planning, maybe we'd use, other things. But there's lots and lots of basic techniques that we can take from counseling practices or, sports psychology that we can use to address your situation. So that's just a very basic example.
Sure. Mm-hmm. How much do you think, just going down that path of stress and cortisol and inflammation, how much is that ultimately impacting a coach's dietary decisions for a client?
Oh, hugely, because I think so many dietary or workout plans are created with the assumption that the person doing them has all other conditions optimal, right? Is getting the optimal amount of recovery. They're getting the sleep they need. They're getting the recovery they need. They're calm in the rest of their life, and it's 2020, things are literally on fire right now. I mean, I don't want to say it's hard to imagine it could get worse. I'm sure it could get worse in all kinds of ways, but, people are so profoundly stressed in the 21st century that, this is my default assumption with you as a client. I assume that you are near your maximal red line of stress capacity, unless you demonstrate otherwise. And, one of the things we do actually is we have to educate people about performance under stress, because, a lot of our assumptions around working out or eating well, I'll just, I have a lot of clients saying, well, maybe later I'll have more time. maybe later I'll have more energy. I'm like, no, maybe later is not a thing. That's never going to happen, right? There may be that one perfect day you wake up and you're like, yeah, it's all coming together, right? But that's not your life, right? That's no one's life in 2020. So, we have to understand that most of what we do is always going to be under less than optimal conditions. And that is our baseline assumption that we start with as coaches, but also that we educate our clients around. You're never going to feel, or almost never going to feel, that perfect conjunction of like energy and time and attention and motivation. It's never going to happen, ever. So that definitely changes our recommendation. And that goes back to what we were talking about with calorie recommendations. It's not that we don't think calorie recommendations are useful. It's just that they're not always the skills or the practices or the actions that our clients really need in this context.
So how does that influence caloric intake?
Well, it might influence the caloric intake the person is currently doing or is trying to do. So, let's take two examples. A lot of athletes are actually what we used to call like hard gainers back in the day. So when they're stressed out, they don't eat. So they lose their muscle, they lose their lean mass, they lose their performance ability to some degree, because when they're stressed out, their tendency is for their appetite to diminish. Right. So those are the folks that find it hard to keep the muscle on them when stress hits. Then you have the folks who eat more when they're stressed, right? These are the folks who struggle to lose weight. And as soon as a stressful situation hits, boom, off to the fridge. So with these folks, stress would affect what they're doing right now, but also what we can get them to do in the future, right? So if you're a stress eater and I hand you a calorie deficit intake, maybe you can do that for a few days until you have a stressful meeting at work, right? And then it's just off the rails. So in my planning, I have to kind of account for, I may need to put particular skills in place before we get to the calorie guidelines in order for you to be able to handle that stressful situation so that you can eat the way that you want or need to eat. So it kind of affects it in terms of like, what we're seeing right now, like how do clients walk in the door, right? But it also affects how does our work together occur over the long term as they cope with their life.
What strategies would you suggest someone implement in that case? Because I'm going to guess there's a lot of people that deal with that in both directions, right? People who say, hey, I don't eat and therefore I don't gain muscle, and people who say, gosh, I just can't stop myself when I do. And I know a lot of listeners have reached out and said, hey, what is your intervention?
Yeah, the interventions would be different for different people, right? So for example, for the people that really struggle to eat under stress, we find things that are calorie dense, nutrient dense, that they can tolerate when they're stressed. So for a lot of people, that might be liquid nutrition. That might be, put everything in the blender, make a super shake, and then drink it, right? Because it's more likely you can eat that versus like a real food meal that might be just like aversive. So that's one of the strategies we use for those folks. And then for the folks who are stress eaters, we might teach something like, we call it noticing and naming. So it's like a basic mindfulness or some kind of basic self-regulation strategies, right? Emotional self-regulation. We might teach slowing down. This is such a simple tool, but just getting people to slow down their eating speed is hugely effective, because as they slow down, they're able to get those executive functions back in control, the thinky brain, they're able to notice what's going on. They typically consume less during a binge. So even if they do binge, if they binge slowly, they consume less energy. So typically with the stress eaters, we would attack the stress part of the equation.
Absolutely wonderful. So you mentioned that you guys are evolving into a performance certification, which is exciting, and I'm curious to hear all the details about that, and maybe some ideas and suggestions how you suggest people would eat differently if their objective is performance rather than just generic health.
Yeah, it's a good question. And when you say performance nutrition, the terminology is really interesting, and we've kind of grappled with this a lot at Precision Nutrition because we work with folks who aren't just athletes, but who are highly active. So for example, folks who are in active military or tactical frontline personnel, a lot of people fighting forest fires right now. There are jobs that people can have that are extremely physically difficult. And these people also need good nutrition, right? So we kind of circled around, do we call it sports nutrition? Do we call it performance nutrition? And one of the other problems is a lot of traditional sports nutrition does not consider the person in context. And, hopefully one of the themes people take from this conversation is that we're very concerned or interested in the person in a context, right? How are they in their whole life? And so a lot of sports science is like, okay, eat X grams of this at such and such a time, or for every hour of, your training or whatever. But they don't really think about, okay, who is this person as a person, and what are they doing in context, and what are all the other factors that may make it easier or harder for them to achieve this? So one of the things people don't realize about athletes, for example, is that they're broke, most of them, right? We have this idea of like multi-million-dollar athletes, who are the top, 10% wage earners, right? But that's not most athletes. Most athletes are broke, or, hustling a part-time job, or at the juice bar at their gym, or living out of their car, or, really struggling to make ends meet in lots of ways. And so that may be a much more limiting factor for their nutrition. Can they afford to buy the food? Do they have a car? Like, are they living on campus at a university, right? So there's all these other factors that could affect your sports nutrition that are not dealt with in sports nutrition. So we've come up with this idea of movement nutrition that supports movement. And the idea is, over a certain threshold of movement, if you move often enough, if you move intensely enough, that changes your body's need for energy, for nutrients, and it means that getting enough of all of those things is much more crucial for you. It's a much more make or break situation, right? If I'm a regular person, I'm sitting on the couch, I don't get enough protein, it's not great, but it's okay. But if I'm a high performance person and I'm training intensely 35 hours a week, now it's a big deal, right? So we've come up with this idea of like movement nutrition and looking at the person in context. So what people would learn when they took this certificate would be obviously all of the classic sports nutrition stuff, right? Grams of this, keeping your electrolytes balanced, like all of that stuff. And also how to work with a person in context. So the way we have a little diagram of it, it's like, there's like a little circle of like specific nutritional recommendations. And then there's like a larger circle of how to coach it. And then there's like the biggest circle of like the person in context. So I'll stop there kind of for reactions and clarifying questions, because I have a sense you probably want to do a deeper dive into something I've said here, or maybe learn more.
No, so ultimately I just want to start to understand, what this certification is, and ultimately who it's for, right? So my audience is primarily physique focused. Mm-hmm. So a lot of us are looking for things that are like, hey, what should I be doing with this? Yeah. If I'm doing a high volume type training versus a contest prep versus a, whatever, bulking session, like what is it? What are all those different variances is ultimately what I'm looking for. It's like, so if we call this performance, it's like, okay, my lifestyle ultimately is whatever it needs to be to support my highest level performance. Let's assume that's the audience. We're looking at the cream of the crop, right? People who ultimately want to be the best of the best. Mm-hmm. And then the variances from training phase to training phase. I'd love to have you just speak to that a little bit if you can. So yeah, totally. Yeah.
I mean, and I think the word variances is a really good one here, because a lot of what we do in this certification is help you think through almost like the flow chart of decision making about your nutrition, right? Because I think that's one of the hardest pieces for people, because there are really like infinite scenarios that could occur here, right? If we consider all of the variables, age and weight and goal and training time, and whether it's Tuesday and whether it's 3 p.m., like there's so many variables that can come into play here, right? So one of the things that we teach is this like decision-making tree, right? If this, then that. If this, then that. And we also talk about trade-offs, right? So if you're seeking this and you're moving in this direction, to some degree, you might sacrifice this and have to understand that you have to relinquish some of this to get more of this. And I think this is one of the crucial factors to understand about performance, which is that often to get top performance, you have to sacrifice other things or trade off or compromise on other things. So, we would give specific recommendations of like, okay, if you're trying to do this under these conditions, do X, Y, and Z. Here's the formula for you, right? So we have a whole resource, for example, on cutting weight. it's like 20 pages long on how to cut weight, and it's very, very like, if this, then this, if this, then this. But, so I think there's the specific recommendations, right? How to calculate it, how to determine what you need, what variables are more important than others. But there's also a lot of stuff around, okay, now that you've got your recommendations, how do you actually do it? What does this look like in real life? So for example, we have this whole resource on carb loading for endurance athletes. That is also something like 20 pages long. But it also is like, okay, here's all the specific amounts, all the recommendations for you, but also here's how to do it, right? Here's how to execute, and here's your shopping list of stuff. Like, I think that's the missing piece in a lot of these recommendations is, okay, now I know my amounts, but how do I actually do this? So that's the piece that we include as well. So people will get those like really super practical like skills as well.
So what I really wanted to drill down on there was ultimately how often should someone be changing the nutrition, correct? Because we see that the variability ultimately could be day to day or even hour to hour if we were so able to be intuitive, but then you run into the subjective nature of I'm just going to rationalize all these different changes that I may or may not need. So I'm curious if you guys made some suggestions around, hey, stick with this for this long if this is your objective, or is it like trying to ultimately teach them how to have this dynamic thought process that changes, like, hey, I know I did extra work and I worked extra hard on training today versus I had a really bad workout versus I had really poor sleep versus I had this massively stressful event. Like, ultimately, if we could hand people that doctrine, right, that skill set, like, hey, this is how you do it in a dynamic way, that would be interesting.
Yeah, I think so too. And it is much more of the latter. Although in the case of the former, for us, there's always this balance of stability and variety, right? And I think, often people seek variety for the sake of variety. Like, oh, I need to change things up all the time. And you have trainers saying, oh, your muscles need to be confused. And, like, this is really not a kind of physiologically valid thought in a way, right? But at the same time, we do need to accommodate variability, and our training will have variability. We're going to have training days, like you say, hard training days and low training days and different phases of athletic competition. Is it competition time? Is it off season? Like, when is it? And so really what we're talking about is finding the optimal balance of stability and variety. And so to circle back to your question of like, how often should people change? I would say as often as they need to, but not more often than that, right? So some people might go along using foundational principles and, feel, look, perform awesome. That might be great for them. Other people may need to do a little bit of give and take. But I would argue that if we think about long-term homeostatic regulation, it's probably not as variable as many people would assume. I think we often like complexity because it feels like doing something. It feels like being productive. It feels like being sciencey. Yeah. It may not be what we actually require, because the body is also very good at like sorting things out in the wash, so to speak, right? And so it's like I was saying before, what occurs in the space of a week? Again, maybe you go on this great new diet for a week, it's awesome, and then your body's like, oh, hey, let's regulate that, right? So you get long-term homeostatic regulation that may completely negate the entire project. So I think we want to be this is what I'm saying. I think we want to be careful about variability and not overvalue it. So kind of to bring it to its rightful place, if I could put it that way. Yeah.
So we spoke about stress a little bit, and I'm curious as to your favorite strategies to mitigate stress. So are you going after the environmental changes, or is it the psychological changes, or maybe it's additional carbohydrate, or maybe it's supplements, or maybe it's all of them? I'm curious if you had some suggestions for our listeners who obviously we are going through massive amounts of stress. What would you say is maybe the hierarchy of order of selection? Should I be doing meditation? Should I be doing longer sleep? Should I be doing more aerobic work? What are your breath work? What are your suggestions? Carbohydrates, sleep, supplements? What are they?
Mm-hmm. I think the first thing to understand is, as you say, the hierarchy, right? There's no supplement in the world that is as good as an extra 1 or 2 hours of sleep consistently over the long term, right? So foundational practices would be, the biggest rocks in the jar at the base of the pyramid would be things that truly regulate you physiologically. So breath work would be in there, sleep would be in there, mindset training, changing beliefs about situations, having more psychological coping skills would probably be in there, because again, my thoughts are going to affect my physiological state, right? Like if I'm running around panicking going, oh my God, it's 2020 and we're all completely screwed and we're all going to die in a horrible fiery hail, of course my physiology is going to respond, right? So psychological techniques that are some of the tried and true that are aimed at lowering stress, those would be the base of your pyramid. But the way that I would start this is to say to clients, okay, here's the pyramid. Foundational psychological and physiological recovery practices, sleep, calming down, anything that elevates parasympathetic tone, or gives you the ability to get to sink more into that deeper state of rest and relaxation. All of those are at the base of the pyramid. We also can do little tiny, fart around things that might give you slight amounts of relief. Given all these kind of things on the pyramid.
I'm going to put the fart around things in the same category as biohacking, right?
That's right. Thank you. I'm glad you said it and not me, because that's exactly how I feel about biohacking in lots of ways. I think we're it's a bit of hubris to think we can outsmart millions of years of evolution.
Useful, but it is a small lever, like you say, right?
Exactly, right? And so in this athlete guide, actually, we have this pyramid showing, big gains, marginal gains, and all of these things are entirely valid. But with a client, so let's talk practicality. The client may look at the base of the pyramid and say, my life is too insane right now to achieve these base of the pyramid things. Maybe I'm a new parent and sleep is just not on the agenda at all. It's not possible for me to get more sleep. Or I'm on active duty right now, military, and I'm sleeping in a tent with a bunch of other people. That's not on for me right now. So what we would start with the client asking them is just to say, looking at all of these options right now, what do you feel like you're ready, willing, and able to take on out of this whole collection right now? Because even for some clients, 5 minutes a day of meditation is stressful, right? The obligation to meditate 5 minutes a day would give them more stress. They would get more relief from walking the dog, right? So the opening conversation is, what are you ready, willing, and able to do right now out of all of these options, understanding the relative score of them? Right? So, maybe all you're willing to do right now is take this supplement. Maybe you're only willing to take 400 milligrams of magnesium right now. That's where we start. Okay, cool. And recognize that it's, going to be a small percentage improvement, but that's where we would start. So we would kind of combine the hierarchy with reality, right? And I think a lot of people get lost in the shoulds. I should do this, I should do that. The only thing that you should do is what you're fully ready, willing, and able to do right now, and that you can truly manage in a sustainable and consistent way. I do think that what is one thing that's underrated, though, is aggressive physical movement. You don't hear this often, because typically people are like, go sit somewhere and calm down. Right. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm raging, the last thing I want to do is go sit somewhere and calm down, right? For a lot of people, it's much more regulating to expend energy outwards, to go and smash something, right? To go and have a hard run, to go and expend that energy in really aggressive and assertive ways in the world. So I actually think that is a highly underrated stress management technique, punching the shit out of something or or whatever. Right? That's just my 2 cents vote in favor of.
It's the fight, flight, or freeze response, right? And maybe the fight is the one they say, well, most people aren't going to stand there and fight, but getting it out in some way when you're stressed is certainly the movement piece allows you to not embody the trauma and embody the stress. That's exactly right. Kind of mobilize. So what I want to wrap on is, you said that you guys are getting into some behavior change stuff now, and I've been a coach for 20 years plus now, and you hand everybody the best diet for them in the world and the best workout plan in the world, and maybe 5 to 10% of people actually succeed, and the rest of them get a little bit of progress and then ultimately regress and go back to who they were before. And it comes back to this identity piece, right? It's like, who do you identify as? And so that comes into, well, how do we ultimately change habits, beliefs, and behaviors, right? So I'd love to get into what you guys are putting together as far as strategies to change people's behaviors.
Yeah, I mean, It's a super, super interesting question, I think, how to change behavior. I mean, you can spend your whole life trying to figure this out, right? Because of the complexity of human beings in a context. And so one of the areas we're sort of pushing into, the basic survey is, what is behavior change, right? What actually changes behavior versus what we think changes behavior? And I think your example of giving the perfect plan to someone and having only a few of your clients do it successfully is a beautiful illustration of that, right? Like, no matter what majestic plans we create, we have to get people to do them. So where does behavior change actually come from is, I think, a key thing to teach. What are some of the most effective techniques for changing behavior in clients, and also for ourselves as coaches? I'm speaking as a coach now. There are things that we need to do as coaches to make sure that our clients are better at their behavior change. So one of the things we need to learn to do is regulate ourselves, our own frustrations, anxieties, stressors, desires to not push and convince and tell people stuff, right? So that's a whole other piece of it. So what are the most successful techniques with clients, and what are the most successful techniques with ourselves? And there's different schools of thought. For example, you have BJ Fogg's behavior design stuff, which I love. I love BJ Fogg, such a terrific guy. We actually spent a week down with him in California a while back. But he's very oriented towards like environmental and systemic changes, right? What can you change around you or put in place around you to amplify the probability that you will do the thing that you want to do, right? But I've been thinking a lot about, especially with social change, movements for social change in 2020, we tend to think of change as something that happens inside us, like it's an individual capacity that we somehow adjust, right? And I've been thinking a lot about change within relationships and change within community and change within society. And so, in this behavior change certification, we're going to be talking about not just like how do you change inside you or the little things that you do in your daily life, but how can you leverage things like relationships and social support and environmental supports and broader community supports to have change. And I think those are much more powerful levers of change a lot of the time. We know that about 85% of what creates a successful outcome in counseling is the relationship that you have with your therapist or your counselor. So, to me, that's just an astonishing fact in a way. It's not astonishing if you understand how human brains work, but it's astonishing in the sense of like, we assume the change comes from individual wanting to do it on their own and going to do it on their own. But that's not actually how it operates, right? So what we'll be teaching is like super hands-on techniques and skills, things that you can use right now in the next 2 minutes with your clients, but also a broader understanding of like, how does this actually work? What are the levers that you can pull to increase the probability that your client will change? So it's a very kind of broad perspective.
So does that kind of come back to like the 5 people you surround yourself with, like find people who ultimately you want to aspire to, or that inspire you in some way to
that's one part of it. Yeah, that's one part of it. But I think, we really underestimate. And so there's work in things like early childhood education or, somatic psychotherapy around this that hasn't quite made its way into coaching. But it's not just about what the people around you are doing, but how safe you feel in relation with those people, right? Sure. And so we know that we cannot change at a deep level when we're under threat. So if you're in a context where, the coach is yelling at you or like where you're just consumed with your own like angst and frustration, that's threat mode, and you can't fundamentally change and grow under those conditions. And so it's not just about who's around you, but also the quality of those relationships. Do you feel safe and supported within those relationships? And you may not need them all the time. Like maybe you can have just enough so that you have that one role model that's a little bit more prickly or difficult or, alienating that you can still achieve, or aspire to. But on some degree, I think we also need to talk about like, what's the safety of your support system?
Yeah, I just had Dr. Tina Bryson on, who's a childhood education expert, and she's brilliant. And she's got this, her and you would know the name Dan Siegel. Her and Dan Siegel write books. So it's safe, soothe, seen, and secure, her 4S's, and it comes back to adults too. And you think of the exact same thing. If you're trying to get somebody to change behavior, and they're going to work and it's hostile, and their financial situation is hostile, and their home relationship is hostile, like they're always running away from the line, and the likelihood of changing something is effectively zero, right? Until they start to make those changes to that environment and all those contexts, it becomes very, very challenging to get them out of that fight or flight mode. And I think there's a lot of people in that reality right now, spending a lot of time at home, and maybe more than they ever have. Their spousal relationships start to become a little challenging, and they don't really have that safe haven, that secure place where they go, man, I can just go here and be myself. And I try to create my house in a way that's like a spa. Like when I walk in, like I want to put everything down and just, it's clean, it's tidy, it's always feeling like I'm at peace. I'm not having to be hectic, and so it allows me to come home and unplug and decompress. And I don't think there's a lot of people out there who have that reality. So I think you're just creating that awareness of like having some safe haven where you could just be yourself and relax and let all the armor off and feel secure and soothed and safe. I think is a really powerful, transformative opportunity.
Yeah, and I'm glad you put such a beautiful frame on it. And I think the reality that a lot of us have come to confront in very painful ways is that there are a lot of people in the world who never have psychological safety, and it's not because they don't want it. It's not that they simply cannot, right? So I think that's a huge thing to acknowledge, that there is just often our capacity to actively create psychological safety, even as much as we try, is super limited.
Right. And I think as we become adults, it's almost, they just don't have the skill set anymore, right? So some people talk about their parents not being emotionally available or not being supportive and loving. And you're like, well, how well do you speak Chinese? And they're like, what do you mean? I don't speak Chinese. Well, why not? Because you never learned. Well, either did they, right? And so they just don't know how to be that welcoming, loving person for you, because they don't have that secure, safe place for themselves. So they literally don't have it in their heart or their brain, and they can't do it for you. And that's, you're trying to ultimately squeeze juice from a rock, right? And it just doesn't work. So it's an unfortunate reality, but I think it gives context on, if you're trying to change someone's behavior, it's just not going to work. The only way to do it ultimately is accept them and love them, and maybe give them that safe place so that they can in return go, wow, like I actually feel safe, secure, and soothed, and maybe return the same for you.
And for folks listening, this may sound super touchy-feely, right? Like this has no place in coaching. Coaching is about getting stuff done. But what we're talking about here is neuroscience. Like this is not like something this is not some like new agey play the bongo sort of thing. It is how human brains work as social mammals. And so like understanding this, and it's such a weird paradox. It's like, only when people feel safe and accepted as they are, can they change. It's just a weird counterintuitive paradox of human existence. So
we had Dr. Andrew Huberman on the show, who's become a great friend of mine, a wonderful, brilliant neuroscience from Stanford. I don't know if you know him when you went to see BJ Fogg. He's also out there. But spoke about the same thing. It's just like, this is the neuroscience, right? This dynamic balance between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. It's one of the two pathways, and which one are you reinforcing more and more and more? And most people are reinforcing the amygdala, and it almost becomes an impossibility to get them out of the amygdala without huge amounts of really calming stimulus over a long period of time, right? And that's a huge challenge for people who have never had it in their adult life. And I think there's a lot of people in the world like that.
Yeah, for sure. And to circle back around to high performance, though, we have this graph in our athletes curriculum, which is like one axis is support, another axis is challenge. So if you would like to perform at a high level, you absolutely can. It's just that you need a massive amount of support. So as your challenge level goes up, so must the support level. So if you want to go and crush the limits of human performance, by all means, go and take a crack at it. Just understand you cannot do it alone. You cannot do it. Like there's no one who just like on their own volition is going to the Olympics or is cross-country skiing across Antarctica. Like it simply does not happen. Yeah. And I think in North America, we love the myth of the individual hero or heroine, forging ahead on their own steam. It doesn't work that way in real life.
And that's so powerful, because I wish someone had told me that when I started, bodybuilding. I was the island of one, right? I was like, I'm doing it all myself. And I think I would have been so much more fulfilled, more successful, ultimately less stressed, had I just been willing to accept that. And I think a lot of people, I deal with a lot of clients like this as well, who in their past have had no one to rely on, no one to depend on. So now to open up to somebody and say, hey, I'm going to depend on you, it's a very hard thing to do, because they've always been historically let down. So to say, like, hey, I'm actually going to allow someone into my vulnerable space and into my love and into my heart and I'll depend on them is a very, very challenging thing to do for someone who's a type A personality, like most athletes are. Like, it was very, very hard for me, right? Most of the time I was like, hey, I'm just going to put them on payroll, and that way they have to do what I have to do. Well, I didn't know any better, right? And at the end of the day, it was very hard to bring those people in to create your support network.
Yeah, there's a documentary that just came out called The Weight of Gold, hosted by Michael Phelps, and athletes talk about this exact dynamic, that feeling that they have to do it all alone. And so they do have a support team of like technical people, like people teaching them technical skills, but not the emotional and mental skills support team. And the number of them that talk about suicide, or, they give examples of people who have actually done it, is not shocking in a way, but probably should be to all of us, because it's a perfect demonstration of the pressure of high performance without the base of support. So, I mean, not to take it to the extreme, but I think, that's it's at the best, in the best case scenario, challenge without support is unfulfilling, right? In the worst case, it's way worse than that. It really does have significant impact.
Right. And it's very real in the bodybuilding space. It's actually been happening more and more and more. People taking their own lives. And it's a sad thing. And people see them up on the stage or put them on a pedestal, like, wow, they have all their stuff together. They're working so hard. But sometimes that's our outlet, right? That's how we forget about all the things that are missing in our life. The only way we actually feel right and feel good is if we're getting after it, we're doing it ourselves. And there isn't that safety and that security of having someone who you love and who depends on, or you can depend on. It's a huge reality, because the better you get at something, ultimately you realize, like, the more time it takes, sometimes the more selfish you have to be, and to have someone who actually accepts and loves you for that is sometimes a challenge. So anyone out there who's supporting a pro athlete, don't always assume they have their stuff together. Like, just because on the outside it may look that way, on the inside or deep down, they still need that love. They still need that security, even though they may not be willing to ask for it or even accept it when you first offer it, right?
And often the things that drive you into bodybuilding or pro athletics or whatever it is are it's almost like trying to outrun your demons, right? Or feeling like, if I can just control this one thing. And to circle back to the conversation about, what are the specific recommendations for things, I find often, or sometimes, people get lost in the practice of specific recommendations because it's the only thing they can control, right? If I can control my food intake, if I can control my working out and all these other things, or spend time on my spreadsheets and my trackers and whatever, I will have a sense of control in my life that is missing, like, in those other domains, right? And I think it's not accidental that many, many hardcore athletes are, once they finish competing, or even as they're competing, there's also a parallel with substance use or other addictive types of behaviors. Something is driving people, and there's a void that's not getting fulfilled. So we try to put things into the void to fix that.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And most pro athletes don't want to think. They're just tell me what to do. Yeah. Because as soon as they slow down to think, now they have to be there with their thoughts. And
it's horrifying. Don't ever do that. It absolutely is, for sure.
Well, you say don't do it, but the reality is, you have to. Like, you have to sit there in meditation, and you have to find those things that are going to allow you to be at peace with your mind, right? And this is kind of the mission that I've taken on in the bodybuilding community. It's like, hey, you can have this massive amount of muscle, you can have these huge aspirations, and you can strive for excellence and still be fulfilled and safe and secure inside, and ultimately not be angry at yourself and not be depressed and anxious all the time, because you're ultimately not running away from something anymore. You're just creating these skills. You're creating the resilience of, one, the autonomic nervous system, two, the psychological resilience, and then skills to bring yourself out of those deep places, right? And I think that's a big part of the message and the mission of what I'm doing now, the Muscle Intelligence Podcast, is like, how do we help people with this? Because it's real, and it may not just be in pro athletes. It's real in most people, whether or not they choose to admit it.
Yeah, we all have our drugs, for sure. And I think, especially as we age, this necessity of confrontation with the self you simply cannot escape it. Like you might as well do it sooner rather than later. So I joke about never wanting to be alone with our thoughts, but I mean, the fact is it has to happen in order for healthy psychological functioning to occur. And it's super icky. It's really gross. It's deeply uncomfortable, horrifying at times. Like it is literally like traumatically horrifying sometimes, depending on what's in the container. But you must do this at some point in your life. You cannot get to the end of your life without having done it if you want to have adequate psychological functioning. If you want to be an okay person in the world, this task of development has to occur. And ideally, again, it occurs with support, right?
Yeah. I just started into a book, Waking Up by Sam Harris. I don't know if you know who Sam Harris is. Yeah, it's actually perfect right along this context. And again, not really his intent to help people with this, but it's certainly just having them understand the dynamic of the mind as it interplays with spirituality. And even though he doesn't like that term, that's ultimately how most people would view it. So that's my book recommendation for the week. If you haven't already read it, I think it'd be a great one. Krista, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I want to have you send people to either your social or PN, wherever you send them, you can direct them.
Yeah, I think precisionnutrition.com is the place to be for the vast amount of material that we're talking about. And as you just made that last recommendation, I was thinking about how one of our domains of deep health is existential health. It's exactly very similar. So yeah, precisionnutrition.com. I mean, there's so much stuff on there. There's like tons of free stuff, free courses, free articles. That's really where I would begin to learn about all the things that we've been talking about today.
Amazing. So such a great conversation. I really enjoyed it today. Thank you so much for your time.
No, my pleasure.
Appreciate it. All right, that's a wrap, ladies and gents. Thank you so much for tuning into the Muscle Intelligence Podcast. I know you have so many choices when it comes to podcasts. You're here with me, so thank you. I don't take that lightly. I always seek to bring you the best information so you can ultimately live your greatest life in the body you love. Thank you so much to Krista Scott-Dixon. Thank you so much to Precision Nutrition for doing this incredible thing that they're doing. And John Berardi's become a friend. He's a wonderful guy. He's been a guest on the show. And they're doing such incredible things. And this is maybe the most parallel with how I would go about teaching nutrition, which is why I've become an advocate. Ultimately is, yes, calories matter. Yes, food choices matter, but none of them matter if you're not well, if you're not strong, if you're not, at least resilient to stress, if you're not healthy ultimately. And this is the foundations that exist at the bottom of this pyramid that Krista speaks of. So as I said, this was truly a blessing to have Krista on the podcast. Toward the end of the podcast, you guys heard we got into some cool stuff. So if you did enjoy the podcast, I would absolutely love if you shared at least one person that you know and love who is trying to live their greatest life in a body they love. And today's podcast is brought to you by Bioptimizers. You can head over to Bioptimizers and get hooked up with 10% off. Use the code MUSCLE10, BIOPTIMIZERS.com, Bioptimizers.com. Use code MUSCLE10. That's good for anything site-wide. They're going to get my favorite products, as I mentioned in the intro, are going to be Mesyme's Mag Breakthrough and Gluten Guardian. They've also got some amazing probiotics that can help with digestion of protein and a whole new suite of products coming through for you. Have an amazing day, guys. I'm thankful for your time and thank you for being here. Don't forget to subscribe and be here for the next podcast. We got good stuff coming at you.
Thank you so much for tuning into Muscle Intelligence. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to share it with at least one person you know. Make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Ben Pekulski and the producers, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.